In the lively city of Accra, nestled among sprawling mansions and bustling streets, lived Mrs. Florence, a woman of great wealth and an iron will. After the tragic passing of her husband, Mrs. Florence poured all her energy into her only son, Francis, ensuring he grew up in comfort, surrounded by opulence. To her, Francis was not just her son, but her pride, her legacy, and the anchor of her social standing. Every opportunity she got, Mrs. Florence reminded Francis of the importance of their status. "We are not just anyone, Francis," she would often say, her voice laced with both pride and warning. "You must remember that our name and wealth are what set us apart. When the time comes, you will marry a woman from a rich and influential home, someone who matches our class. No less will be acceptable." Her words were not mere advice. They were a decree. Mrs. Florence was determined that Francis would never lower their class, as she put it. In her eyes, love was secondary to the preservation of wealth and status. Yet Francis, with his charming smile and kind heart, was not as consumed by class as his mother. While he respected Mrs. Florence, her rigid outlook often left him feeling suffocated. He yearned for a life where he could follow his heart without the weight of expectations crushing him. Francis had become a dedicated doctor, spending countless hours at the hospital, tending to patients, and often sacrificing his personal life for his demanding profession. His world revolved around saving lives, leaving little room for social engagements or relationships. However, everything changed when Alice joined the hospital as a newly transferred nurse. Alice was stunningly beautiful, with a warm smile that could light up a room and a gentle demeanor that put even the most anxious patients at ease. Her intelligence and compassion matched Francis's own, and it didn't take long for him to notice her. They started working closely, sharing stories during long shifts, and their friendship naturally blossomed into a romance. Alice was everything Francis had hoped for in a woman: kind, hard-working, and full of life. After months of dating, Francis knew Alice was the one. She had filled a void in his life he hadn't even realized was there. With his heart set, he decided it was time to take the next step. One evening, he invited Alice to join him on a visit to his mother, Mrs. Florence, to officially introduce her as the woman he planned to marry. When they arrived at the sprawling mansion, Mrs. Florence greeted them with her usual air of refinement. She studied Alice closely, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, from her modest dress to her warm but slightly nervous smile. Mrs. Florence extended a polite welcome, her tone neutral but not unkind. As they settled in the lavishly decorated living room, Mrs. Florence turned to Alice with what seemed like a genuine interest. "So, my dear, what family do you come from?" she asked, her voice poised yet probing. Alice smiled warmly, her hands clasped on her lap. "My parents are Mr. and Mrs. Opoku," she said. "They live in Aburi. My father is a farmer, and my mother helps manage the farm. We've lived there all my life." The moment Alice mentioned her family's occupation, Mrs. Florence's expression changed. The faint smile she had worn moments ago vanished, replaced by a look of cold disbelief. She shifted in her seat, then abruptly stood up. Her movements were brisk, her demeanor suddenly icy. "I've never heard of the Opokus," Mrs. Florence said, her tone clipped. "Farmers, you say? Interesting." Without another word, she turned to Francis. "Son, I need to have a word with you," she said firmly, motioning for him to follow her into another room. Alice sat quietly, her smile faltering, as Francis hesitated before rising to follow his mother. Once they were alone in the study, Mrs. Florence wasted no time. "Francis," she began, her voice low but laced with frustration, "what is the meaning of this? A farmer's daughter? Is this some kind of joke? After everything I've told you about our family, our status, how could you bring someone like her into this house?" Francis met his mother's gaze, his jaw tightening. "Mother," he said calmly, "Alice is a wonderful woman. She's hardworking, intelligent, and kind. I love her, and I want to marry her." Mrs. Florence scoffed, pacing the room. "Love? Love will not sustain our name or our legacy. Do you know how people will talk when they hear you're marrying beneath your class? A farmer's daughter. I will not allow it, Francis. Think of your late father and the reputation he worked so hard to build." Francis took a deep breath, struggling to keep his composure. "Alice is not just a farmer's daughter," he said. "She's a nurse, a brilliant one at that. She's more than capable of standing by me, and I won't let you judge her based on her family's background." "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice icy. "But if you insist on going down this path, you'll be doing it without my blessing." Francis felt a pang in his chest, but stood his ground. "Then so be it, Mother," he said quietly. "I love Alice, and nothing will change that." As Francis left the room, Mrs. Florence's mind raced, her pride wounded, and her plans for her son's future threatened. She vowed to do whatever it took to break them apart. Alice sat quietly in the living room, her heart sinking as the muffled voices from the study reached her ears. She didn't mean to listen, but the anger in Mrs. Florence's tone and Francis's calm yet resolute responses were impossible to ignore. Every word felt like a dagger to her confidence. As soon as Francis returned, his face a mixture of frustration and regret, Alice mustered a polite smile and thanked Mrs. Florence for her hospitality. She knew, in her heart, that no amount of love could withstand the battle she would face with a mother-in-law who had already declared war. Later that night, Alice sat in her small apartment, replaying the events of the day in her mind. She admired Francis's determination, but she also knew that a lifetime of fighting against Mrs. Florence's disapproval would only lead to heartache. With a heavy heart, she sent Francis a text. "Francis, you are an amazing man, and I'll always cherish the time we spent together. But I can't put you in a position where you have to choose between me and your mother. I don't want to cause a rift in your family. I'm sorry, but this is goodbye." When Francis read the message, his heart shattered. He called Alice, but she didn't answer. He sent texts begging her to reconsider, but she stayed firm in her decision. For weeks, Francis struggled to move on, haunted by the what-ifs and the love he had lost. Over time, though, the wounds began to heal, and he threw himself back into his work. Months later, on a sunny Sunday afternoon, Francis decided to treat himself to some shopping at a local mall. While browsing the aisles, he noticed a young woman in front of him, juggling several items. Suddenly, one slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. Instinctively, Francis stepped forward and picked it up. "Here you go," he said, handing her the item with a smile. The woman turned to him, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, laughing softly. "I always seem to carry more than I can handle." Francis chuckled. "It happens to the best of us." The woman, introducing herself as Adoma, had a warm, easygoing nature that immediately put Francis at ease. They struck up a conversation, talking about everything from the challenges of grocery shopping to their favorite places in Accra. By the time they left the store, they had exchanged numbers, and Francis felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. Adoma was different, bright, engaging, and unpretentious. Francis found himself drawn to her genuine charm. Francis had started to notice how passionate Adoma was about her studies. He admired her dedication to pursuing a degree in information technology at the University of Legon while balancing the demands of everyday life. The more time he spent with her, the more he appreciated her ambition, resilience, and the refreshing honesty she brought into his life. Their bond grew stronger with time, and Francis decided he wanted to support her in every way possible. He discreetly offered to help her with school expenses, ensuring she had what she needed to focus on her education. Adoma hesitated at first, reluctant to accept his help, but Francis reassured her, telling her that her success was as important to him as it was to her. Francis was in love, but he also understood the challenges that came with being involved with someone his mother might disapprove of. Adoma didn't fit into Mrs. Florence's idea of a suitable match, but Francis didn't care. However, he decided to wait for Adoma to finish school before making any official plans for their future. Until then, he kept their relationship private. Mrs. Florence, always vigilant, began to notice changes in her son. He was often glued to his phone, a soft smile playing on his lips as he typed out messages. His outings became more frequent, and while he always managed to balance his demanding job, there was no denying he was spending a lot of time away from home. This didn't sit well with Mrs. Florence. One evening, as Francis was preparing to leave the house, Mrs. Florence intercepted him in the hallway. She gestured for him to sit in the living room, her tone firm but calm. "Francis, we need to talk," she said, her sharp eyes fixed on him. "You've been busy lately, busier than usual. Always on your phone, always rushing out. Now, I'm not naive. I know you're seeing someone." Francis paused, adjusting his cufflinks, his expression carefully neutral. "Mother, I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to deflect. Mrs. Florence's lips tightened, her patience wearing thin. "Don't play games with me, Francis. I'm your mother, and I know you better than anyone else. If there's someone in your life, I expect you to respect me enough to bring her home. Let me meet her." Francis looked up, his face unreadable. He knew this conversation would come eventually, but he wasn't ready to subject Adoma to his mother's scrutiny. He sighed. "Mother, when the time is right, you'll meet her," he said evenly. "But right now, I'm not ready for that." Mrs. Florence raised an eyebrow, her suspicion deepening. "So, you won't admit it?" she asked, her voice cool but laced with frustration. "I've taught you better than to sneak around like this. If you're serious about her, you should bring her home and let us discuss this properly." Francis stood, slipping on his coat. "I'm not sneaking around," he replied firmly. "I'm just taking things one step at a time. Please trust me on this." Mrs. Florence watched him leave, her frustration bubbling beneath her composed exterior. She didn't like being kept in the dark, and her son's reluctance to bring this woman home only fueled her determination to uncover the truth. If Francis wouldn't introduce Adoma, Mrs. Florence decided she would find out everything herself. One sunny afternoon, while Mrs. Florence was out of town attending a business meeting, Francis decided it was the perfect opportunity to invite Adoma over. He wanted her to see his home and spend some quality time together without the weight of his mother's judgment hanging over them. Adoma arrived, dressed simply yet elegantly, her natural charm lighting up the grand mansion. She marveled at the opulence, feeling both nervous and excited. Francis reassured her with a warm smile. "Relax," he said, taking her hand. "This is just a house. You're what makes it feel like home today." They spent the afternoon together, laughing, cooking a light meal in the massive kitchen, and sharing stories about their lives. For a moment, Francis felt a rare sense of peace, free from the looming shadow of his mother's expectations. As the evening approached, Adoma prepared to leave. "Thank you for today," she said, smiling up at him as they stood near the entrance. "It was wonderful to see this side of your life." Frances leaned in to kiss her forehead. "I'm glad you came. We'll do this again soon." Just as Adoma turned to step outside, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze them both. Frances's heart sank as he recognized the familiar black SUV. It was Mrs. Florence. What will Mrs. Florence do next? Will she let her pride and status stand in the way of her son's happiness? And how will Frances handle his mother's shocking reaction to Adoma? The drama has just begun. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you.